Iris? You want to start? Okay, good afternoon. My name is Alfred Tovias. I am from the Department of International Relations of the Hebrew University, for those who don't know me. And the roundtable, I suggested to the conference organizers to do is on the impact of the energy crisis in the European Union, on its relations with Israel and its Mediterranean neighbors. Now, the purpose of the roundtable is not only to get insights and an update on a current subject that is drawing a lot of attention, as you know, in the specialized press and think tanks dealing with the EU's institutions, energy policy, external relations, and foreign policy, geopolitics, international law, international security, all this. That's good, per se, update. But the second purpose is to diffuse to the audience the particular aspects of the subject regarding which the two academics we have here and myself have done on this subject. So the concept is to draw as much as possible from the wealth of knowledge and analytical thought devoted to the subject by ourselves. So each of you two should devote 15 minutes presenting your research and insights. I will then add 2 or 3 points that seem to me fairly original as well, that you don't read every day in the newspapers, because that's the task of academics. So what we are not going to do is to make now a presentation of all the gas conundrum in Israel or the basic information, because you have it, or we assume you have it. We must make an effort in this panel to present the EU's angle, the European angle, and not so much the Eastern Mediterranean angle of it, because here we are at the Association for European Studies, and this is what our focus should be. Now, let me introduce you to the two members of this roundtable. The third one could not attend because of illness in her family, in his family. I'm referring to Dr. Yossi Mann, who apologizes for not being here this afternoon. The first speaker will be Professor Arie Reich, and Professor Arie Reich, apart of being professor, has been formerly dean of the Faculty of Law, and he is the vice rector of this university, Jean Monnet Chair of EU Law and Institutions, has authored over 50 academic books and articles on topics ranging from international trade and investment law, public procurement law, European Union law, competition law and torts, and so on and so on. I spare you reading the list of all his articles in peer-reviewed journals. The second speaker.
I thought maybe you add that he's a former president of the association.
Yeah. Of course, he's a former president. He has been everything. And Dr. Lior Herman is at the Department of International Relations of the Hebrew University. He's a senior lecturer there. He's the chair of the International Political Economy Graduate Program, chair of the Energy and Geopolitics Research Group, as well as of the Climate Change Politics Research Group. And I know that he co-authored a book with Professor Herman on Israel's path to Europe, which is basically a review of the relations of the EC then with Israel from 57 to 1975, and particularly the negotiations to conclude a partial preferential trade agreement in 1970. And I very much advise you all, those interested in the archaeology of the relations, to look at it. It's very well researched. But before giving the floor to Arie, I would like to remind you some basics really connected to Europe. There is a fundamental mismatch between supply and demand of gas in Europe since 2020. I'm reminding you that before that, there was a glut over 5 years between 2015 2020, when the price of gas was particularly low. Now, the main cause of this change is because of the Russian flow of gas interruption, but also apparently because the Groningen field in the Netherlands is supposed to close down, or was supposed to close down this year, because seismic factors caused a lot of fear in the public of the Netherlands, something that I was not aware of before, but that has contributed as well as creating a tremendous pressure on Europe as such. Now, there are a lot of tensions going on inside Europe, in particular between Spain and France, because Spain is able to maybe supply from its LNG plants and its connections with Algeria energy to Germany, but France is totally opposed. On the other hand, Germany is violating flagrantly the state aid rules of the European Union by launching a program of helping consumers and industries using energy intensive procedures, this is seen by other European member states as undue help to its industrial base against the others. I spare you more about this. Now, in the middle of all these tensions, one bright point as far as the EU-Israel relations are concerned, and this is the EastMed pipeline project continues to be considered a project of common interest. Initially decided that it would be a project of common interest in 2013. It has been reconfirmed in the 5th EU list of projects of common interest at the end of 2021. That's good information, but also another information which seems to me relevant is that the feasibility studies of the EastMed pipeline were completed already in 2017, and the conclusion was that it is possible depending on the price of gas, of course. And an investment decision apparently was scheduled to be made by the end of 2022. So it looks like, because of the new situation, that this EastMed project is going to be launched after all. I remember being interested in the subject for the last five years, that it was said that there was no chance whatsoever that the EastMed pipeline would be realized because of the price of gas, precisely. That was the main argument. And George Mitchell, who is a very important expert in Israel, was saying this and was making a fun about this. Now the situation has been reversed. Now it could reverse again. Think,
Think about that actually.
yeah. So the last point I want to mention here is that in the middle of all this debate of gas, already everybody's saying, okay, gas can be helpful in the short term. But if we maintain our objective of taking care of climate change, we must switch to hydrogen. But it appears, I was not aware of it, it appears that gas pipelines that you construct could be used also to convey hydrogen. So the whole thing now is if this East-West pipeline could be used for another purpose later on, transport hydrogen, because if this is the case, then you will probably find investors very much interested in launching the whole thing. Okay, so to finish this first intervention is to say that the EU in the Eastern Mediterranean is not only going to be a trading partner as far as gas is concerned, that seems clear now, but it's going to be a geopolitical and security actor as well. Normally, when we speak about the EU, if I'm not wrong, correct me, we dismiss its geopolitical and strategic role in this region. We say Russia, we say Iran, we say the United States, we say Turkey, and that's it. The EU seems to be absent. But only think about if the project is launched, the interest of the EU in preserving the infrastructures from terrorist attacks. It will have a stake. So it will have to put its nose into what goes on in the Eastern Mediterranean. So this being said, please. Arie.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Alfred. So we'll be till 35.
Yeah.
So the topic is transit of natural gas to Europe. So the assumption here is very clear to everyone, is that EU is desperately in need of gas from everywhere, except for Russia. I call it non-Russian gas. They could buy US. They could buy LNG, which means liquefied natural gas from the US. I don't know if they have the capacity. It's also more expensive. And I should say this is a research at the very beginning. And actually, I'm doing this together with a new PhD students who arrived here very recently from the Ukraine, Igor Klotzman. And
Long live Ukraine.
Yeah, so there's at least some positive aspects of it, very few of the crisis there. So we have more questions than we have answers, and actually the aim of this presentation is to focus on the legal aspect of it, because in the end we're lawyers, experts on international law, but in order to understand the background to the legal questions that I will raise, you need to understand the various options of this question, which is, so we have gas we want to sell to EU. EU wants to buy it. There's only one question: how does Israeli gas or Cyprus gas arrive to the EU? This is the question: how to transport the gas safely and efficiently to Europe. And this is where, at some point towards the end of the presentation, the legal aspect will come in, because there are some questions here of how do you guarantee it. Speaking of all these pipelines, etc., they raise various questions. They're legal questions, and here maybe the law can come in and help to a certain extent to mitigate not to eliminate, but to mitigate certain risks. And so let me go over various options that have they're talking about in the literature, in the newspapers. This is changing all the time, by the way. What you read a month, that was not what you read today. So one of the options you just mentioned, and this is the EastMed pipeline, I'll talk about that. Another one is to build a pipeline to Turkey, and from Turkey, having it transported through land pipelines to the EU. Another possibility is already in place now. We sell it to Egypt. Egypt has an LNG plant. There they turn it into liquid. I'll talk about that. A fourth one could be to using pipelines that go through Northern Africa. We heard about that Morocco is attached to Spain, and there are talks about Algeria also. So I'll say a little bit about that. So let's start with the EastMed pipeline project, which Alfred mentioned. So the idea of this project is to build 1,900 kilometers, no less, submarine pipeline from Leviathan, which is Israel's biggest gas field, via Cyprus. You can see here on the map, from Cyprus to Crete, and from Crete to the Greece mainland, and from there to Italy. At some point, this pipeline would reach the depth of 3 kilometers. So there's some very thorny technical engineering issues with this pipeline. The projected cost is 6 billion, but these projected costs tend to grow. And the planned capacity is 10 billion cubic meter a year. As we heard, the EU committed itself to and has already invested money to doing a feasibility study. I would say, and we had an accord that was signed by Israel, Greece, and Cyprus in Athens on 2nd of January 2020. This agreement, and it talks about cooperating in building this pipeline. And it was approved by Israeli government in July 2020. However, it was met by Turkish opposition. The main reason being that Turkey wants the gas to go through Turkey and not to surpass it. They say you're just trying to surpass us. And they can use also the fact that you're going through our waters, maybe, and the Turkish part of Cyprus and claims like that. And in January 2022, the United States withdrew its support to the project. I still need to understand why, because from what I read, and again, this is not my field, and I need to speak to people in government, but I understand that the chances for this project to go through are less and less, are more and more slim, and more. And the truth is, I've heard it for several years already that many experts say they don't believe this project can ever happen. So
it was in January,
yeah,
not in February.
Before the got a point. So anyway, I don't know. I shouldn't make speculations on things I don't know, but it's enough that we say that it's in doubt. So if it's in doubt, let's check other. Although some of the things I'm going to say from a legal point also has relevance to this, but we'll talk about some of the other options. So another option would be LNG. Why is LNG? So LNG is the process where you turn this gas into a liquid, and it takes 600 times less space as a liquid than it takes as gas, and that makes it possible to transport in big ships and containers. And the problem is that to build a plant, liquefying plant, takes enormous amount of space, and it has to sit on the shore. Now, in Israel, for that to happen is very unlikely. Our shores are taken, and no neighbors are going to like this. They're going to be huge demonstrations. So building a plant in Israel is really out of the question. So what are the other options? It could be an option, what we're doing now, we're selling, and Egypt has a big plant. We're selling gas to them already. And then from there, it could be transported to wherever. There were talks about Cyprus putting up one. but there's also, oh, okay.
You're not in a presentation mode.
I know, because presentation was got stuck, now it's got stuck. Okay. It answered me. Okay, there's another interesting option, which is the floating option.
What's the problem with Egyptian?
Capacity. Yeah, capacity. They, first of all, they themselves consume an enormous amount of gas, and what's left, I'm not sure it's enough for the Europeans.
But you can expand that facility. It's simpler than a pipeline.
Yeah,
Awesome.
we
We don't know. I say there's I have many question marks. I don't know the answer to all this. Okay.
I will relate to some of it.
Okay, thank you. Another option is floating. This is also something relatively new. It was the first such plant was put in action in 2016 by Shell, so you could put such a huge boat basically next to the gas field, and there then you can have like another boat coming in and taking this liquid gas, and from then it could be exported anywhere. I don't know what to tell you about. I know this is being considered by the Ministry of Energy. Will that solve the whole problem? Will it be enough capacity? I don't know. Another possibility, which also I think is less viable, is for transporting through North Africa. We talked about something called the Med Ring. The problem here, it would have to go through many hostile countries such as Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and it's questionable. Of course, gas, once it goes into Egypt, you don't know, it doesn't have a color. It's not blue, white, red, or green. But still, it's we still remember what happened with the Egyptian gas going through the Sinai to Israel, and was attacked many times by the terrorists until they decided to give up. As a result, all of our electricity bills went up 20-25% when we stopped using Egyptian gas. And so another, please move.
Maybe the time.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so really, if putting politics aside, the most natural solution would be a pipeline to Turkey. Pipeline to Turkey would only be about 550 kilometers. It would be under water. Its cost would be 1/4 of the East Med, about 1.5 billion euro. And from Turkey, it would connect to existing pipelines that go to Greece, and from there they basically attach to EU grids. It could also supply Turkish consumption because they're also a huge consumer of natural gas. We know that Itzhak Herzog was in Turkey a few months ago, and it was declared, he was here, by the way, today also. I met him today here in Ilan. Yeah, he visited our energy center. Okay, connection. And they talked about energy, and many commentators say that the reason that Erdogan all of a sudden is changing his ways, his talks, he's all of a sudden opening Israel, he wants this pipeline. It's all about energy. Okay, we have low politics becoming high politics, connecting to what Gerald spoke about today. So here is what. Can you go to the next one? Okay, so here are some. Thank you. Here are some problems with the pipeline to Turkey, which I want to relate to. So it goes through the exclusive economic zone of Lebanon, Syria, and Cyprus, which is something we have to deal with. And of course, the other question, obvious question, is can Turkey be trusted as a transit route to Europe? Right? One day he's like this one, another day he calls us Nazi. So I leave the politics and the prophecies, the politics to the politicians and the political sciences, and the prophecies to the shotim, to the prophets. And I'll talk about what law can contribute to this. So this is what you do, like this.
You, Arie, now which one to you?
Oh, okay. So what do we have? So we have the World Trade Organization. We have the GATT. GATT, yeah. GATT, Article 5 talks about freedom of transit. It applies to products, but gas is also a type of product. Oil is a product. So it's agreed that it could also apply to, that it applies to energy resources. Now, both Israel, Turkey, and EU are WTO members. So if Turkey would play up something, they could be sued within the GATT system. We know, however, the weaknesses of the system, especially after the US has blocked the appellate body. We're not going to get into that. Lebanon and Syria are not members of GATT, so that could be one problem. Another important protection we have is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS. Now, Israel has not joined the UNCLOS yet. However, UNCLOS, most of its provisions is considered to be customary international law. And as such, for the non-lawyers among us, it applies to all countries, to all states, by the mere fact of them being member of the community of states. So, and here is a very important thing. The whole idea of the fact that you have rights in your economic water, in your EEZ, is because of UNCLOS, it's because of international customary law. And that same law in Article 58 says that you only have right to take advantage of economic resources, but you cannot stop another country, not from going through their ships, nor from laying down pipelines. Okay, so not Syria, not Lebanon, and not Turkey could oppose us or EU putting down a pipeline. This is something important to keep in mind. Now, there's also a court for the law of the sea, which Israel cannot use because we're not members. EU could use because they are members. Okay, the next one is the Energy Charter Treaty, which was mentioned here today also in the previous session. Israel is not a member of the ECT, although about 4 or 5 years ago, I gave here a talk calling for Israel to join the ECT. We haven't done so yet. Turkey and EU are members, but here's something you need to know, that even so if gas goes from Israel through Turkey to EU, the Turkey is still under an obligation to allow free transit to EU. So you don't have, Israel doesn't have to be a member for that to happen. Article 7 of ECT imposed an active obligation to guarantee freedom of transit for energy resources for all parties to this agreement. Israel wouldn't be able to sue Turkey if they would obstruct it, but EU could. And they have just as much interest as Israel to do that. So that gives us some insurances, even if we wouldn't, no, in 2 minutes is fine. So a fourth option, which would be, I think, recommended option, this would be my recommendation, is actually to if we decide to go on the Turkish option and by building a pipeline from Leviathan to Turkey, I would recommend these three countries to negotiate a trilateral agreement: EU, Turkey, Israel. That would be custom made. That would be address the specific problems of this whole issue of free transit, of maybe also financing the whole deal, and with the strong dispute settlement mechanism and strong enforcement mechanism with sanctions, etc., which would exactly custom made for our purposes. And Israel could, since Turkey is really keen to have this, Israel would be in a situation, if it plays its card correctly, and also the EU, to make such an agreement a condition upon building this pipeline, and only after it having been properly done and have proper provisions in it, then agree to embark on this project. That's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Can we
Thank
ask
you.
maybe
we right away go to Lior. I appreciate very much that you contributed to our knowledge of something we don't know. And please,
Thank you very much, Mr. Tovias, and it's really, and thank you also for inviting me to this roundtable. It's nice to be back in the association, particularly when Alfred is leading this panel. And as Yoram said earlier, when Alfred calls, we come. So what I'll do now, I think we have had some bad expectation management here. So I'll improvise something at the second half of what I'm going to talk. I'll explain it in a second. I'll first talk about the subject, not necessarily connecting particular research, as Alfred said earlier, because my research on Europe particularly has been done in other respects of energy, but I will relate certain things. And I think what I'm going to sort of improvise a bit, I'm going to talk about the long run and a bit about the geopolitics of renewable energy, which is something really interesting. And I think because this is Europe's aims in the long run, I will relate to some of it and some of the findings that we had in the past. But we've heard a number of people talking about this subject earlier. I'm not sure in earlier panels. I'm not sure that my opinion, either I guess Arie's opinion, are the same. And there is a degree of sort of like it's a bit of a thriller, right? What's going to happen? So I'll tell you the very beginning that I think that despite the fact that crises are opportunities, I'm not sure that this particular crisis has a significant opportunity to, a real opportunity to significantly increase the energetic cooperation between Europe and Mediterranean countries. And I'll explain it. And I want to also thank Arie because he laid out the foundations here, like explaining certain possibilities and options, and so it will help me be a bit shorter on this. Having said that, by the way, the fact that there is not a lot of scope, it doesn't mean that we don't need to institutionally invest in promoting cooperation and providing the right political climate and the institutional environment and the market environment to support that. But I think as far as we discussed energy flows, okay, so I'm talking about natural gas and perhaps also electricity, I think the options are actually quite limited. So I'll start and I'll say a few things first of all about Europe. There is no doubt that Europe is undergoing an acute and severe energy crisis. It's not going to fade away in the near future, and it's a very also asymmetric crisis. Some countries suffer more, some countries suffer less. We see things we haven't seen for years. We see people in Poland burning litter, to warm them up, to warm themselves up. In Hungary, people are chopping down trees. In Switzerland, people will get fines if they, warm their house above 19 degrees. And as some of my Swiss friends have no worries, all my neighbors will actually snitch if I do that. So it is enforced. Even in Germany, Germany that once gave, not long ago, gave money to South Africa, that South Africa will reduce its own consumption of coal, is now importing coal from South Africa. So I'm not going to go into Europe's energy mix and everything, but I will say, because it really varies among states, but I will say that into 2021, Europe's energy mix was 76 fossil energy. That means that about 34% was gas, 31% was oil, and about 11% coal. Renewable energy, the long-term sort of target, was only 14%. So when I say renewable, I talk about solar, hydro, wind, bio energy, and nuclear energy was of around 10%. This is important because some things can be replaced easily. The sources can be replaced easily, and some things are not. For example, oil is something that can be shipped very easily around the world. It's a global commodity today, unlike, for example, natural gas, although it is becoming, and Arie mentioned liquefied natural gas, LNG option. Okay, so I'm going to say a few points about Europe. First of all, as I said, the crisis has different implications for different countries. Some countries can cope better with it, and then perhaps they have less urgency of, for example, looking at the Mediterranean and the costs involved in that. And some, it is more important to them, but they don't necessarily are able to do that. The second thing is that it is important, as I said, to cooperate at EU level. But I think that from at least from when it comes to energy flows, okay, it is with specific countries. Every country in the EU has the right to decide where it buys its energy mix, okay, and they do that as such. And therefore, you do it with countries rather than with the EU. And in a second, I will talk about each country or some countries and what is actually possible. Obviously, there is a great EU interest and European member state interest, particularly specific member states interest in stabilizing the region, right? And that's why we see a big involvement of Europe, for example, in the East Mediterranean gas forum. We see this in encouraging the Hellenic partnership between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. And a recent example is the pressure put by various member states and the European Union on Lebanon to accept the deal with Israel. So all of this is really important. By the way, the same goes what you hear or you might hear soon about the support to develop Gaza Marine reservoir. There is a reservoir, actually the first reservoir, gas reservoir that was found before Israel discovered its own gas field was offshore Gaza. It's a very small gas field, about 32, I think, BCM. It has never been developed yet, and now there are talks about it.
BP, no? It was BP?
It's at that time it was British Petroleum. They've been, dragged back and forth. Eventually, they left the whole region. It was sold to CPC. It's a Lebanese Palestinian owned company. Sami Puri, I think, is the name, and the Palestinian Investment Fund. They got it, and now there are discussions with Egypt to get this going. I'll say something about it in a second. Now, the third point here about Europe is that we should look at this need for natural gas and perhaps oil, because coal in the Mediterranean is less relevant. So the need to import from the Mediterranean as something which has a sort of a bound or a limited time horizon, right? We're talking here about transition to renewable energy, which at least according to the ambition of the European Union, we're talking about something about 10 years, right? So that means if I'm a market actor, that means that I'm sending a very important signal, right? That what I need is for about 10 years. And if investment in finding new fields in construction, costly infrastructure is as I said, is very costly, right? I would hesitate before I do that. And this is sort of decreases the economic prospects of getting these things done, looking for new gas fields or building this costly infrastructure like long pipelines or LNG terminals. So after sort of putting a few points here about where Europe is, I want to say a few things about several countries. I will because of the nature of the panel where we are, I will say more about Israel, right? But I will speak about several countries. So first of all, Lebanon, right? Lebanon is in the news. As I said earlier, Europe has put a lot of pressure on the Lebanese to accept the maritime border demarcation agreement. It is very important to several European actors in the private market, for example, like Total and others, because they are interested in drilling and getting gas and oil. And in that respect, yes, there is a lot for Europe to do with a country like Lebanon. But as far as the energy crisis is related, I don't think that Europe can really find the solution in Lebanon, right? We don't know what's offshore Lebanon. Even what we know now is at a very low certainty level. Until you don't drill, you don't know how much there is. So you will hear a lot in the media about yes, there is gas, yes, hydrogen is very important, and so on. But it's not necessarily always as it is. There is a lot of interest to market things. It's not necessarily the case. Beyond that, remember that Lebanon in itself is in an acute energy and political crisis. It's not going to be solved soon. It's so acute that we know today that Lebanon is probably getting around from Egypt Israeli gas to power its own electricity. So by the time gas or oil will be commercial there, it's going to take a few good years. Now, Israel is, I think, what's really interesting a lot of us here. And there are several points here about Israel. Okay, Israel is a relatively small player. Okay, we might want to think about ourselves as important players, and I certainly understand that. The whole natural gas that Israel has is less than 1,000 BCM. Okay, out of that, according to the regulation and the law, Israel needs to retain 540 BCM for domestic use. Okay, for its own energy consumption. The rest can be exported. Israel uses about 12, 13 BCM per year. Recently, the Arie committee, Arie was the Director General of the Ministry of Energy, said, okay, we should actually increase the number of the amount of natural gas that can be exported. But the reason is that Israel has this renewable energy ambition, which by 2030, Israel should have 30% renewable energy here, and therefore it will need less natural gas. So that's one fact to remember. But nevertheless, this is what we are allowed to do today. As of today, 150 out of these about 400 BCM that we can export are already committed. They are committed to Jordan and to Egypt. So if we think about what we have and what we can export, okay, it is somewhere, let's say the best scenario, if we export everything, 15 BCM a year, okay? A more likely scenario, also very good scenario, if we could, about 10 BCM per year for about 15 years, okay? So it's good in terms of revenues for the gas companies. It will be good also for the state revenues, but it doesn't really solve Europe's needs, right? Europe needs about 140 BCM every year, right? And we're talking about giving about 10 BCM. Okay, so let's put things at the right perspective. I think that's really important. And also, as I said earlier, just note the fact that Israel was not able to draw in the last couple of tenders to draw international investors to actually invest and look for new gas fields offshore, because the estimation, the professional estimation, the geological estimation is that if there are, and there possibly are several other fields. Recently, there was another field found next to Karish. They are very small. Okay, there are, let's say, the capacity of Gaza Marine or Tanin. They're not big enough to draw interest. The second thing is, or together with it, remember that up until today, export to Europe is very low. It's done through those LNG terminals that Arie mentioned in Egypt. There are in two places, actually two terminals, one in Idku, one in Damietta. But the Egyptians don't really have a lot of interest to allow us to use these facilities because we are competing with them, right? So, so the fact that we have an MOU, and we heard a lot about the MOU, right? You know, I was once trying to do something at the university, and I wanted to sign an MOU with another university, and I was told that there are about 700 MOUs of the Hebrew University with other universities, but eventually, you know, only 20 are like really substantial, right? So MOUs can be signed, and there are a lot of MOUs which are signed, but they are memorandum of understanding. They're not fully fledged agreements, okay? So bear that in mind. Today, the gas companies in Israel can already export to Europe, and they don't do that. They don't do that because of the technical and political and economic capacities of how to get the gas to Europe. So in order to get the gas to Europe, we need infrastructure. This could be pipelines. So East Med pipeline that was talked about earlier. The restoration, I would say, of the East Med pipeline, because it was already buried and now it's sort of coming back, has, in my opinion, a non-feasible economic rationale. It's built on assumptions which we cannot really project so long. Today there are like huge differences between the gas price in here in Israel and the gas price in Europe. This will not be the case when there is this very, very ambitious and perhaps not even feasibly, technically feasible pipeline would eventually materialize. This is going to happen 7 years from now, 10 years from now. Can anyone estimate what will be the gas price at that time? I certainly can, although I do have a crystal ball with me. You said about the prophecy was given to some people. Maybe I am a shoteh, but I doubt it. Another possibility is this Turkish pipeline. Okay, so yes, there are many safeguards that we can do, but I'm not a lawyer. I'll say from a political science perspective, IR science, that I think that the likelihood that this pipeline will happen is very low, given everything that happened between everything that happened. Okay, so I will talk about in the Q&A. I will talk about the other thing that I said. But given everything we know about how energy, and I'm talking about research, energy constructing peaceful relations, I don't know a single case, okay, when energy with I know one single case, one exceptional single case. Okay, that's the European Coal and Steel Community. That's the only example in history where you have energy leading peace, right? And not the other way around. It can cement peace, it can help peace, like the peace agreement with Egypt, where you had oil exchange done, but it doesn't create peace. And we're not in a situation today with Turkey that we were many years ago. We had very strategic cooperation with Turkey, and I think the level of distrust is huge. And I think this is also what people in the government think, that regardless of this kind of dancing that we have today, I don't think it's going to happen. FLNG is actually
what's interesting is that the trade has been going up. Erdogan is talking, and the mutual trade in Israel and Turkey.
This is true, but we are talking about a strategic commodity. Okay, we're talking about strategic commodity, and I don't think Israel. Yeah, and okay, I would say so I will say another thing. Okay, I've done research on how market actors respond to these kind of uncertainties, and they cannot put a number on it. Okay, I remember an investor telling me, I had everything right. We had guarantees, we had many things, and so on. We had countries wanting to do that, for example, Egypt and Israel, or Jordan and Israel. But at the end of the day, I could not. This political security uncertainty was something I could not price. FLNG, I think, is a possibility, but then again, it can increase. Yeah, FLNG, floating LNG devices. Remember, it's still costly. It's very new, and we don't have that much to offer, as I said earlier, but it is possible. I would say from an Israeli perspective that Israel needs to also think about its own energy security. I have serious doubts, and I'm not the only one, that Israel can meet its 2030 renewable targets. It never met its targets. Today, we're producing about 6 to 7% of our electricity from renewable energy. Okay, remember the target is soon to be 30. I can discuss later why I think it's not going to happen. There are so many obstacles for this, but if you want, I can explain that. So Israel doesn't want to be in a situation, or shouldn't be in a situation, where in 20 years it doesn't have natural gas reserves if it needs, and then it has to buy expensive gas from elsewhere. And I would only say one thing, that the Israel electricity company has already had problems of purchasing natural gas from the companies that produce here offshore. There is one thing which was not discussed here, was Israel as sort of a bridge from the Emirates. And there were discussions about having a pipeline for oil coming from the Emirates through Israel, and then on containers onward to Europe. That is a possibility. It's not even that costly, but it has grave environmental consequences, and also political consequences, because it actually competes with the Egyptians. And our relationship with the Egyptians are quite important. It competes with the Suez Canal, with the possibility of containers moving there. So it's very beneficial for Europeans, for Israelis, for Emiratis. It's not necessarily something that people are going to like in Egypt. Let me take questions afterwards, because I have this, the hammer here. One thing where we could do have a cooperation, and we can have a significant cooperation, and is cooperation on energy and climate technologies. I think there's a very good basis here, and those are existing, and it has as we discussed earlier today, has a very good institutional sort of framework around it. And that also includes the Repower EU initiative, which was discussed earlier. About the Palestinians, I don't think that the Gaza Marine is an option for exporting to Europe. It's a very small gas reservoir. The export will be probably to Egypt and its own domestic use. Although we still have Hamas, right, in Gaza, and there are many obstacles around it. Israel, I don't think, is an obstacle, by the way, for the development of Gaza Marine. And then two more things. Egypt has the biggest reservoirs, gas fields around. But Egypt can also increase its export capacity to Europe. It can expand these LNG terminals as well. But it is also a country that has unmet demand for natural gas. A lot of gas is needed. It has its own energy and economic crisis. And therefore, in order for Egypt to export to Europe, it needs to purchase from someone else. That's why Israel has this agreement, right, with Egypt. Israel is exporting low-cost natural gas to Egypt, and they are selling their own gas to Europe at a higher price, right? And we're doing it because it's beneficial to us, and we're doing it, right? So remember how much extra we have to give, right? So it's also not how much can you actually do that. I'm not going to talk about Libya because I know very little about Libya. I would say that there is another option that has been discussed, Morocco. Okay, Morocco having big solar fields in Morocco, using like the idea of having Jordan producing the electricity for Israel. So having doing it there. This was discussed, by the way, in the past. It failed. There are many problems there. There's also an issue of dependency, which is there. Remember that there are limited capacities today of storing energy. So people are talking about the possibility for good storage maybe in 5 years, but it doesn't exist yet. Before concluding, a few brief points, okay, not about states, but about several aspects. One is the interconnector. Okay, there is this Euro-Asia interconnector, which was discussed. The idea of having an electricity grid connection to Cyprus from Israel and from Cyprus to Greece and onward to Europe. That will connect Cyprus to the European grid. It's the only country that is not yet connected. This is true, but there is a question how much actually Israel can send. There's also economic questions here, because the idea is that you sell when you have a surplus, and but usually it means it relates to the time of the day, and the time difference between Cyprus and Israel is 0. So I'm not sure whether this is beneficial. And there's a lot of loss of electricity on way, right? So if we, like, for example, when you produce electricity in the center of Israel and you send it to Ilan, you lose half. Okay, that's a longer review. Half of the electricity on route. In a recent paper, which was really published in the last few days in a project I'm conducting, but I didn't publish it. It's one of the other authors about Norway. Okay, there are also geopolitical problems in connecting grids. Okay, Norway, a country that has surplus electricity, surplus energy, is not so interested in selling electricity to Europe. Okay, because it's afraid of being subjected to the European market, energy market rules. It's afraid of losing what is called energy sovereignty. It's going to have effect on local prices. So these things need to be considered. As for hydrogen, I think hydrogen is really, particularly, green hydrogen.
Is the distinction between selling energy directly and then via a cable as opposed to selling gas?
Again?
say Norway's reluctant to sell energy.
And electricity,
Energy, right.
electricity.
Right,
Electricity.
electricity as opposed to energy in the form of gas.
Yes, yeah. Because in Norway, you have 100% of renewable energy. They use 100% of their own, right, which is renewable. It's hydro and wind, and they sell the fossil to the rest of the world, and then they say you have to be green. Hydrogen, I'll just say this is really in its infancy. To speculate now that the East Med pipeline will take hydrogen, I think it's interesting, but it's something that is rich infancy. One thing which was not really discussed so much, and I think this should be, there is an opportunity here, are cities, okay? And this is a bit of our discussion because we are talking about states, okay? We're thinking about states and states cooperating and companies and so on. But what we see today, we see ordinary cities. I'm not talking about global cities, which were always involved in international relations. We see normal cities which are taking actions on their own in terms of climate adaptation, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of moving and switching to renewable energy. And they do it independently without going through the state, right? They do it in networks with other cities around the world. And we see a lot actually in Israel, for example, with European cities. So this is something that has a potential and will probably grow. And I'm going to stop by saying, sorry,
Which city?
several cities. Tel Aviv is really big in this. Eilat,
Doing what? I didn't understand.
they're connecting in networks, alliances of cities. There are different alliances. Sometimes, by the way, sometimes they do it bilaterally, but alliances. And under these alliances, they decide about common regulations, about joint cooperation. Sometimes they get funding from different facilities.
Is it abroad or in
What does
Israel?
I'm talking about cities in Europe and cities in Israel, which are connected. Okay, like C40.
In what way they're connected? I don't understand.
They're not connected physically. They're connected in a network where they sit together, like you sit in the OECD and you decide about different rules and how you're going to play the game, and what you're going to do, and what kind of you learn from each other, from joint learning and so on. There is scope here for cooperation.
Good.
It's not about energy flow.
Okay.
If that is your question.
As I see, there is a lot of interest and it's fascinating. Let me launch here officially an idea that is crazy, but that's our function here. The idea comes from what you mentioned before, the European coal and steel community. Okay, I give to you that the European setting was a very special one, etc. It never mind makes me think that coal and steel were chosen not only because they had contributed to war, and we know the usual story, but because there was abundant coal and steel then, who are not anymore important, but were then important. So that's also, as I mentioned, I want to discuss it. And leading me to propose, or me to start thinking about if it would make sense to have an East Mediterranean solar and gas community. Okay, the two equivalents to coal and steel where we are very abundant is the sun and the gas. The sun in the form of solar stations. And I want to mention here the fact that Israel is now exchanging desalinated water, if I get it right, with against solar energy
No.
from
Remember,
Jordan. It's a project.
Remember, it's an MOU. Okay, it's not. There's nothing has happened.
Okay. I agree with you. But if the exchange is between desalinated water, it's because and solar energy is because the idea is that there is ample spare space in Jordan plus a lot of sun. It goes together, and in Israel we have this power of desalinating water. And this is what makes the business now, or the complementarity, as it was said here. Now, instead of thinking in those terms, one could think also in terms of the gas. We are already exporting gas to Jordan. And the idea that Jordan could provide electricity when we don't have enough is also, in my opinion, appealing.
But you want to
it
establish
would-
a community like
Yeah.
with a high authority, like.
No, no, wait a
commission,
minute, wait a minute.
A council,
Now I
a
am,
parliament,
now I am free to this.
and a court.
Okay, I wanted to make a simple contribution in our thinking in institutional terms, because this is most of us that have been teaching this are always insisting that the lack of trust between France and Germany let Monet and companies say you need to overcome the lack of trust, institutions, etc. Now, I know that in Israel we make a mockery of all this because we must be autonomous, we must not rely on, we must only rely on God. He comes to help us, but the rest is bunk. Okay, that's where it starts. Now, I don't want to make a big show here, but I have been thinking, it's not connected with this, how daring, how crazy was Schumann when he was proposing what he was proposing, because I was thinking that, let's think that was 1949 when he launched the first idea, and that was 4 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. I mean, was he a collaborator? As a matter of fact, I have discovered, you will not like this, that Schumann was wishy-washy concerning the collaboration, wishy-washy, because I have been digging, and if you want to know, he was a member of the first Pétain government. I have found that out. He resigned afterwards, but he was a deep believing Catholic. Now is going to be maybe made a saint by the Vatican. And I don't tell you what the Vatican was at that time. So what I mean by that is that our Saint Schumann was not so saint in Jewish eyes. And he had the gall of proposing in 1949 that we are going to cooperate with the Germans. What was he thinking? That the coal and steel community would be managed by different Germans than the Germans that were in 1945? I mean, if you think for a moment, I mean, Adenauer, the Saint Adenauer, okay, but what after the other ones? You could not expect 4 years after the war, if you think for a moment, that the German cadres, the German civil society had changed. And this community was to be managed from above, you remember. I mean, that was the Monet viewpoint, without the people. It was the people up there. Okay, so how should we judge this? We are all Europeans. We are for Saint Monet and Saint Schumann. And I will finish with this, but this is the proper forum to discuss this among Jews, and not only among Jews. I mean, it was daring, it was crazy. And how come, I don't understand, how come the French accepted that? I mean, if you think for a moment, in 1949, 47, 48, the roads of Europe were inundated by refugees, movements of population, chaos, the freezing people, etc. And there was the Bosch, I mean, the Germans, the monster Germans, etc. They were still around. How could he say, oh, let's change our mind and cooperate? Oh, why did he? No, I am saying this because when we speak about what you say and what is we are in a much better situation than Schumann was in 49. If I might say, okay, that's all.
American pressure.
Yeah, now he was online.
Since you raised it, let me get back to you on that, but we want to talk about energy. Not all Germans were the same.
Yeah.
There was always another Germany, and that's the Germany with which the French wanted to do business. I'm saying you're suggesting that all Germans were Nazis.
No, I am not saying this.
Well, because you say it was the same Germans as
Well,
etc.
the cadres had been working with
yeah.
the regime.
Certainly, there were other Germans to work with after the war. Just to put this, I think the record straight on that.
Mm.
Now, about energy. I think if I had to be a European designer for the aggregate European interests, I would think for the long term in two different ways. First is for how long Europe will rely on fossil fuel. And second, does it want to buy an insurance policy against geopolitical risks? What we've been discussing here is subject to all that. I'm sure there are enough bosses in German industry that would tell you that, well, look, Putin did a terrible mistake. But come on, I mean, at some point the crisis will really be resolved or even frozen in Ukraine or something like that. And we can go back to business as usual with Putin. The pipes are there, it's cheap. Let's not get hyped up, too much. But I think even they recognize that even if that were possible, and I'm not sure it is, there are heightened political risks. This could happen again if they ever went back to Putin. It can happen later again. So even those people recognize that they need to get themselves an insurance policy, which means you need to diversify, and it doesn't come cheap. It's about insurance, not about supply. And that's why even Israel matters. It's small, but it's a drop in the bucket. If you focus on one major supplier because that makes sense economically, you're exposed to these geopolitical risks. You need to diversify. You need 1,000 drops, not a single pipe.
Mhm.
And the Israeli drop is another drop. It won't solve the whole thing, but it would be one in a basket of opportunities and options if there are problems. So you're not going to help that insurance policy if you send a pipe through Libya, nor through Turkey. They are two geopolitically dangerous countries. Granted, taking from a leaf from the page of risk management and finance, if they're not correlated with the Russian risk, it's still okay. But I suspect Turkey is. If Russia gives you a hard time in Europe, Erdogan will give you a hard time to go with. So Turkey is not an insurance policy against Russian instability. Maybe Libya, they have their own problem, which is disconnected. But why do that? Why not go for the more stable regimes, Israel and Egypt? On the immediate term, expand liquefaction in Egypt. That shouldn't be too difficult. I'm not an engineer, but it seems reasonable that in a matter of years, not decades, you can expand up production. What?
Germany has done that. We didn't know. They're
No,
big-
that's regasification.
Oh, right.
It's not the same thing. And for the longer term, 6 billion in European terms, that's not too much money. Do it. Do it for your insurance. What? Yes,
Yeah,
basement.
yeah.
Instead of talking and talking and talking, wasting time on this, just do it. Now, for that, there's an important energy meeting today and tomorrow. The European countries should go for collective purchasing. Once the European Union has, you don't need another energy community. You just need to let the commission the power to buy collectively. They've done that with Corona.
Mhm.
Well, that's a mixed result thing, but eventually they sorted that out. And I think the commission has already experience in buying Azerbaijani. Yeah, so that has happened in the past. It's not like there's no precedent for it. They need to do that. And once European can bargain and act collectively on ensuring supply, this is what they need to do. But then domestic politics intervene because plenty of Europeans don't want Europe to find another source of fossil fuel. They'd like this situation to force Europeans into, an alternative and source of energy. But I suspect immediately that the pain is too hard. So I would urge the Europeans to actually do the East Med after decided on collectively buying and investing in it. It's not too much money. It's worth as an insurance policy. And I think that this is what they.
Let me give you,
There is another question there.
I mean, it follows up on what you just asked. I just wonder how much of a long-term investment it would be to create that pipeline, because eventually Europe also wants to move to renewable energies completely. So if you build it, it will still take a couple of years. And say even if it's finished in 2030, which is probably quite optimistic, that's that's the time where a lot of countries in the EU have already like aim to be 50-70%, like depending on renewable energies. So it's not really a,
Then they can carry hydrogen.
Yeah,
exactly.
well, but that's not completely.
Yeah.
Okay,
Safe, that's
firstly,
not
I
impossible.
think Arie
Right?
wanted
May I
to react.
connect to this, maybe?
Sorry.
I
Arie,
I have maybe a very, very basic, vague question. If I understand correctly from Lior, the amount that Israel is able to sell or supply after deducting its own use and whatever we sell to Egypt or whatever, I couldn't follow the numbers, is a very, very small amount of what Europe needs. So I don't understand the logic of all these pipes and projects and the interest in buying from Israel once it will not answer their problem.
So the East Med pipeline would also move Cypriotic gas. They also have big gas there, Aphrodite,
And potentially Egyptian gas too.
and also for Egypt. Egypt has a huge gas.
Altogether, it will be reasonable.
That's the idea. But your point is very well taken, and they even now, even in the MOU, it mentions that in 2030 we want to start moving down from fossil gas.
Well, I'm not being true, but breaking news, it was last week that some Spanish company signed a contract with a Dutch company to actually send hydrogen from Spain to the Netherlands, produced out of gas and converted through solar energy in southern Spain. So the pipes may be useful in the end for green applications too. It's not completely necessarily for gas.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to, go back and forth and argue about that. I'd say that hydrogen still, particularly the green hydrogen, is something that is in its infancy. It's not something that you can actually invest now in such a costly pipeline to transfer it. And also bear in mind that even the gas in Cyprus is disputed with the Turks, right? We still have a dispute around it. But if I was if I had to make an insurance policy, and being a former insurance regulator, I would actually do something which is perhaps socially unacceptable in some countries in Europe. I would actually invest in my own production, which is nuclear facilities.
They closed down.
They closed
down.
First of all, this is part of the problem, right? The idea was that gas would be the transition fuel en route to the to renewable energy, right? Because Europe understood already long ago that it can't rely on Russia. The problem was the shutting down, or one of the problems was shutting down nuclear facilities. Now, just look at Germany recently decided to hold down the shutting down of two old nuclear reactors. The new reactor, this is a long time investment, okay, in Finland. But if I had to think long term, as you say, in sort of about a policy, an insurance policy, I would actually consider this. If you can, it's very efficient. You can do quite a lot with it. It's far more reliable, by the way, from renewable energy. And here I relate to what you said earlier about renewable energy. Remember, renewable energy is not a panacea. Okay, it is not. It is unreliable in many things. You have problems with intermittency, problems of storage, various issues with it. Sometimes there's no wind, sometimes there's no sun. I don't see the world moving, and hydro is the exception, okay, because hydro is different. I don't see the world moving so fast to 100% renewable energy and up to 70. I don't see planes flying with solar energy or something else. So it's going to take a long time, and we will have. I'm sorry for being a bit dismal here, but we will have. No, we need. There is a difference between what politicians say, okay, and what they aim and what sounds really good, and we all want to move, and we know we have a climate crisis. And I live this in my academic research. Right, I know it's important to move to renewable energy, but there's also an issue of feasibility, right? And you have to balance between various things. Everything has an opportunity cost. we will need to live with a mix. And the mix will be of renewable energy alongside other.
Let me just say one
Like
thing.
busting
I wanna-
nuclear reactors.
I want to say one thing in favor of the Turkish option, okay? I'm no less a fan of Erdogan than anyone sitting around the table. But I want to remind you all that Turkey is a major trading partner, not just of Israel, but also of the EU, and they're very much dependent on the EU. They are part of a customs union with the EU, and for them to stop gas running to EU would be crazy, especially when they're in a very, very bad economic situation. I also remind you of how Turkey cooperated with the EU and helped the EU, save the EU from a refugee crisis. Okay, they agreed to stop the refugees, and they have millions of refugees from Syria and from other places. You've been to Istanbul, the streets are full of them, and they agreed to stop them. They did some deal with the EU, and because the relations with the EU are important too. So I think that's another a realpolitik argument in favor of the Turkish option, although there are, I don't say
Okay,
there are other options.
But to counter your argument, I think we are not aware about the tremendous damage to international order that has been created by the United States and the European Union by using with such a frequency international economic sanctions. Remind you that for many, many years, the idea was that let's separate economics from politics and let's not use economic sanctions for political purposes. Now it is finished. Now it has become an habit. So I ask you, how do you want to guarantee that at some stage, because Turkey does this or that, the European Union in such an agreement is not going to sanction Turkey? That means it has become an habit nowadays to sanction, to use sanctions. We shouldn't do this. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, but wouldn't have you sanctioned Hitler? Well, Putin is Hitler. It's not that I am against the sanctions, but if you start with this, don't be astonished that authoritarian regimes apply sanctions, because if democracies apply sanctions for every Tuesday and Wednesday, so this is pure chaos. So I mean, maybe it's the future. The future is economic sanctions because the economy is so important. But it's terrible because the only way to get out from a multiplicity of sanctions seen from a national viewpoint is to diversify, as Tal said. I mean, that's the only way to be sure that if someone sanctions you, it's going to be only one that sanctions you, not everybody. Until everybody agrees to sanction you, it will take a lot of time. That's what Russia thinks nowadays. Okay, the West sanctions me, but I have China and India. Okay, so yeah, everybody thinks that the sanctions on Russia are not working, are not working, but it has become a fashion. I mean, that the first thing you do is sanction. The West is using this. If Putin or Xi Jinping in China use sanctions, we say he's a monster because he's using sanctions and whatever. But we use it. You remember the times of the GATT? How many people were using sanctions? Nobody. Okay. Now it has become.
But that's another
okay.
topic.
Yeah.
Just two informative questions.
Hmm?
What was in the agreement or whatever signed recently with the Minister of Energy here of Israel and the Van der Leyen? Somebody came from Europe to sign an agreement with her?
It was in the European, it was in the East Mediterranean Gas Forum.
It was what?
In the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. They signed this MOU, which was about the possibility of exporting more gas through the facilities in Egypt and also Renew EU program and all these things.
So it's practically it's going to happen. Just
Well,
No,
happening.
it's there is
Selling
a
gas to Egypt
Yeah.
already.
to Europe.
And
Not
this is
yet.
like-
No, I am not
It
sure.
was an expression of goodwill of doing it and sending signals to the market and et cetera, et cetera. But we have to see whether it's going to happen or not.
Is Turkey a member of this task force? No.
That we sell to Egypt and Egypt sells to Europe.
That Israel would, I don't have the document in front of
No.
me, but it was about Israel and Egypt selling more gas to Europe.
Europe. Thank you. And then to Arie, you mentioned a few times. Arie?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh, multifunctional.
Well, yes, yeah.
And you mentioned a few times then, when going through the legal options, the kind of rite of passage, right? That you are allowed to put your pipes through EEZ of another country. And
Not in the exclusive economic zone.
yeah. And are you aware of interpretations of such clauses in the treaties? Because it might be limited in some way. Say, I can imagine that if your pipes are disturbing some activity of the state, or if they harm the
This is
environment,
future work for my doctor.
right? So it's not just you have the one passage and everything is fine, but right? It should be limited.
I look, yeah. No, it's not limited, but you know, we'll do more work on it.
Yeah, I forgot to say that the only antidote against sanctions, seen from a national viewpoint, is not only diversification, but it's also storage. That's another technological issue that seems to me very interesting to explore. How can we store not only gas, but electricity, light, etc.? I am inventing, but the battery technology and all techniques, because if you want to be sure in a case of emergency that you are not going to be cut off, as you mentioned, there is the possibility of diversification.
We have an energy center here in Bar Ilan. We're working on it.
But as a matter of fact, the EU has made a decision to have 80% storage for this winter demand for natural gas. It's already that close to 90% across the EU, but it varies between member states. Not all member states have the same kind of capacity. Okay, some member states actually have gas storage in other member states because of that. But I wanted to say two things. I don't disagree with the diversification. I'm not sure that this region is necessarily the place to diversify. And we see that LNG, buying from Qatar, buying from other places around the world. That so diversification is not necessarily bad, but I would actually think also that an own capacity. I do want to say one thing, just for illustration, about what I said about renewable energy. Okay, 2 years ago, in July, Israel's electricity demand was about 14,000 megawatts. Okay, that was the peak demand. In 2030, this number is about to be around 18,000 megawatts. Okay, in order to cover 30% of that, right? So a quick calculation would be around 5,300, a little more, megawatts that you need to produce from renewable energy. Okay, now if you do you know Ashalim, the Ashalim power plant, the one with the big
You mean Mordors? Yeah.
exactly, that's one, right? This is it's a huge thing, right? You know what's the size of this the area size of this plant? 4,000 square meters. Okay, 4,000 dunam. It produces 250 megawatts. Okay, so you need about 20 like these. Okay, so imagine what kind of land you need for this. Okay, so now wind will take a little less, but just think about all the protests, and we know this is something that we know. I published about 4 papers only.
Yeah.
You try doing it, and this is no. You should look at what's happening all across the world and extensively around Europe about social acceptance, community acceptance of having these renewable energy facilities. it's a major problem. If people think that they can substitute what we have today from fossil fuels by producing with solar panels on the rooftop, it's not going to happen. You need a lot of space for that. So that's why I'm sorry for saying all of this, but it needs to be said. Okay,
If you
this is the
join
truth.
me on November 5th, I have a hiking weekend near Ilan. I'll show you places nobody knows.
You know, the fact that the stone and the fish don't have an interest group doesn't mean that you will be able to do that.
Yeah. Okay, any other question?
I just wanted
Or
to
are
ask,
we exhausted?
How
I
about
just,
dinner?
just wanted to ask if Turkey is member of this Mediterranean gas. Forum.
No,
It
no,
is
they're
not.
Because of Cyprus, right?
Cyprus,
Yeah.
Greece.
Also,
So
Egypt,
you see,
also Egypt.
Egypt.
Egypt doesn't want them. in fact.
which,
Good. So I think that with that, we are closing the conference.